The first was just on Motown. Motown, just a lot of people here don't know what Motown is.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just been a 50th anniversary. I know you were very much involved in a lot of the 50th anniversary celebrations. So how do you explain to someone what the legacy of Motown is?
First of all, Motown is I should probably go all the way back. Something that has evolved as the Motown sound basically is all of the artists and all of the music that came out of Motown, and that was in the 60s. From 1961, the company was formed by Berry Gordy, and he was the type of guy who was an entrepreneur. He was a boxer at one time. He was also a music writer. He wrote for Jackie Wilson. And so one day he decided, along with friends, that perhaps instead of him doing these things on the side, he should form his own company. So he borrowed money from his family, I think something like $800, formed this company, and started bringing in acts: the Miracles, Smokey Robinson, the Temptations, the Four Tops, Little Stevie Wonder, Mary Wells, of course the Supremes. And so he said, everyone really likes rhythm and blues, gospel, this and that, and it's all black music, but it's not reaching across the board to everyone. And again, this is at a time when in America, there was the segregation, so things were not as open and people couldn't listen to everything they wanted to listen to. So he said, let's try to make the music less of an ethnic sound. Let's kind of open it up so it can be enjoyed by everyone. And that's how he created the thought of a sound. So he took the R&B and he kind of just cleaned it up a bit. People said it was homogenized, that kind of stuff. But started having hits. The Marvelettes had the first million-selling record at Motown. And then, of course, the Miracles, and, of course, the Supremes. I'll just talk about us right now. So, and Marvin Gaye. How could I forget Marvin Gaye? Oh, my God, what's going on? So, basically, Motown and the Motown sound is that sort of music that was created by all of the artists that I've mentioned. And it's amazing that it has lasted, as you mentioned, 50 years. I mean, to say that this music is still popular 50 years afterwards is really quite wonderful. And the legacy of the Motown artist is just amazing. So although people don't really know the Motown sound, they know the music. Can we just cut for a second, George? Yes, thank you. I'm waking up here. Thank you. Okay.
Well, Motown was rooted in a time and a place. Detroit, what was Detroit like then? And do you think that Motown could have happened anywhere, or was there something special about Detroit at the time that created this explosion of creativity?
Well, music was happening all over America. I mean, you had your spots. You had the Chicago, you had the Philly sound, Stax, the Nashville. So it was happening all over. But I think the phenomenal part about Motown was that Berry Gordy came up with that concept of what the sound. So you had a lot of artists singing with the same kind of feel. The musicians were called the Funk Brothers. So we had the same musicians playing for all of these artists. So there was a similarity that made, even though the songs were different, it still made it, you just knew a Motown record. It didn't sound like any other record. But yes, it could have happened anywhere else. But I think the defining point is that there were so many of us at the same company, and I think that's what made it different. But the music was happening in other different areas. But that was what it was. I mean, you had like 20 acts, all Motown. So that was, I believe, the one thing that brought it all together in one area. And it was the water in Detroit.
Yeah. Well, at some point Motown had a 75% hit rate, I had read. And some had said that Berry Gordy had used the factories, the factory approach to making music. Do you think that that's fair or unfair? Or?
Well, you know that Detroit was a car town. I mean, automobile industry was in Detroit. So Mr. Gordy had worked at the factories, and that assembly line approach is what I guess people are comparing Motown with. And that was because, again, we had so many people, and we were all doing the same kind of thing. So there's a similarity there. And also, it's similar to the Hollywood business because, I mean, you know, the way they groomed the artists, the actors and actresses was pretty much the same way. Because at Motown, we had people there who taught us various things. We had Mrs. Powell who taught us etiquette, and it was like a finishing school. And she said, one day you're going to be performing before kings and queens. And of course, we were just teenagers, and we laughed at her because we were like, and we were black, we're living in the projects, we were singing before kings and queens. Yeah, sure. But it came true, you know. And she used to say, you all are just diamonds in the rough. And that was the most beautiful thing someone could say to you, you know. And that's what they did. They polished us up and shipped us on out there.
What was the most important thing you learned from her?
How to give interviews.
Oh, really? What did she tell you?
Well, it's amazing. It's not so much I'll give you another example of what she taught us, how to get in and out of limousines. Now, at the time, we didn't know, we were only 16 years old. I had never seen a limousine myself, except on television, perhaps. But she taught us how to get into them in case there were paparazzis, and that was before paparazzis. So if you're approaching the limousine, and instead of turning your rear and getting inside, which is kind of just normal, she taught us how to slide into it, you know, to come up to the door and slide like this and slide inside and get in like that. So, you know, guess what? Some years ago, there was one of the younger, singers who had a very bad picture in one of the trade papers because she had gotten into the limo very unladylike. So we learned those kind of things back in the 60s from Mrs. Powell.
Yeah, we talked about this sort of civil rights context.
Yes.
And I understand that you were on the road, you're performing in all over the country. Were there some parts of the country that were really difficult for you to be traveling and performing at that time?
Oh, sure. I mean, that was a norm to be, traveling in the South and to know as a black artist, to know that you can't go to certain places. So you could only go to the establishments that cater to black people at that time. And, there were many artists before us, the Sammy Davis Jr.'s, the Lena Horns, all these type of people, the pioneers, who would work these great places like Las Vegas and not be able to actually live in the hotel or to gamble there, So, yes, we encountered that a lot because that was just the way it was, but thank God those things have changed now in America.
In the exhibit, we have a picture of Ed Sullivan, you and Ed Sullivan. Can you explain to people who might not know who Ed Sullivan was, what the significance of that was?
Well, the one thing about the Supremes is that very early on, we started doing television. And again, I kind of hate to keep going back there, but this is Black History Month, so it's okay. This was at a time when on television you did not see a lot of black faces unless they were doing menial jobs like janitors or maids. Women were usually portrayed as maids and things of that nature. So there were very few sort of positive roles and glamorous roles that you could see women on TV. So the Ed Sullivan Show was a TV show that everyone watched. I mean, it was a family kind of show. Every Sunday, you and your family would sit down and you watch Ed Sullivan Show, and he would have all kinds of acts on there. So when we had we being the Supremes had our first hit record in 1964, we were asked to go on the Ed Sullivan Show. So we went on there, but I don't think we were on there for that record, for the second record. And we started going on, every time we would release a record, we'd go on the Ed Sullivan Show. So it became one of those things where, especially early on, where we're like, oh my God, we're on the Ed Sullivan Show. And at first he didn't know our names, so he would say, and here they are, the girls. You know, but pretty soon he knew, he got really chummy with us, and he knew who we were. But the significance of that is that once we did that show, we knew we had actually made it. I mean, it was a different thing to see black, beautiful, successful people on television, and you had people like Diane Carroll, who had her first TV show and things. So it was again an honor to be on the Ed Sullivan Show. It was a time that families gathered together and watched TV. I remember working in Florida, some of the hotels there, and we would have a lot of Jewish families who would come to our shows. And this was like 1960, maybe 65, 66. And so this one Jewish woman came up after the show. She says, I just want you to know how I allow my family to watch you girls whenever you're on the Ed Sullivan Show. And it was very strange because I remember my brother, who was kind of like a Black Panther. He was on the other side, right? And he says, Mary, what does she mean? She allows her family to watch. I'm like, well, you come from a time when that is true. So we were bringing this positive image so that people were like, oh, okay, it's okay to be friends with, a black person or to watch them, whatever. So that was when times were changing during that civil rights movement during that time. And I'm just very happy to say that, we were one of the ones that were there at the time that the change was coming about in America.
Yeah. Did you see yourself as being part of the civil rights movement? Did you see what you were doing as something that was contributing in some way, or did
Sure,
you, yeah.
Of course. I mean, if you're black and you're doing something that positive, and we get that question a lot, and I always say, well, wait a minute, of course we knew, you know what I mean? We came from a time when we had nothing and when no one looked at us. So now we're doing something positive. You know that one thing in the black community, your parents would always say, you represent the race. So when you walk out this door, you carry yourself in a certain way. And we grew up, being told those kind of things. So when we became one of the faces of the civil rights movement, of course, we really honored that position and thought a lot about it. That's why I'm very happy that Motown was the type of company that gave us, outside of school, it also gave us another sort of level to achieve our dreams, to make our dreams come true. And, because now you see artists out there who are really wonderful, and they're making more money than we ever made. But, even though they're doing these things, they don't seem to have the grooming that they need before they get out in front of the public. And it's just so important.
Well, the gowns. I mean, we're so pleased that you lent these, part of your collection for this exhibit. You picked out the gowns for this exhibit by yourself, and they're so beautiful.
Yes.
Why did you pick out do you remember the gowns you picked out? Did you have a reason for picking out particular ones?
No.
Yeah.
I didn't have a reason for picking them out other than they've just come off of a tour in the UK. And they were there for, I think it was 2.5 years. So a lot of them are so fragile from all the years. I mean, we're talking, they're quite old now. So we had to kind of have them repaired and all, because there's one set, and I didn't send those, that is so beautiful. And I mentioned earlier doing a command performance for the Queen Mother. And we had these pink pearl gowns. They weigh 35 pounds each. Beads, sequins, pearls, all kinds of encrusted with all these things from here to up to there, all the way down. And we wore those with the Queen Mother, I remember, and they were just so beautiful. But because they were in England for that 2.5 year period, we had to take them back and kind of whatever. But I always like for those to be in the exhibit because you look at them and it's like looking at just, oh my God, and they're just still so beautiful after all these years. They still are very, very beautiful. So
they're wonderful, and they're still as stylish as they're.
Yes. Well, what we did try to achieve with this exhibit was to have a sort of chronological sphere to it, so that we had some of the earlier ones on up to so you could see how they got really flamboyant, at the end. It was wonderful wearing them.
Well, great. Thank you so much. That's
great. No, I'm not through yet. So I want to tell you about how I got the gowns, how it became an exhibit. Because, there were 3 of us, Dinah Ross, Florence Ballard, and myself. So each time a person would leave the group, they'd have to leave the gowns because the group was continuing on. And it ended up that, of course, Florence was no longer in the group, and then Dinah Ross went out to become, Dinah Ross, to do these great things that she's doing. And so then I ended up with all these gowns. And they were in boxes. I mean, they were literally in boxes in my storage for years. And so eventually, I'm like, I got to do something with these. They're there. I hadn't even looked at them. I hadn't looked at them in years. And the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in Cleveland, Ohio, had inducted us into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And it was then I heard that they were going to start an exhibit, a museum. And so I said, oh, that's great, maybe. So anyway, after they inducted us, I was speaking with some of the head of the department there. And so I told him I had the gowns. He says, oh, really? And we started collaborating, and eventually they curated the gowns for me. They came out to my storage. We opened the box together, and that's how it all got started.
Oh,
yeah, so it was really quite by accident, I guess you could say, that they were still intact.
They're so beautiful.
Well, thank you very much.